I'm gonna go right at zone 7. 6 to 7 with the highlights of the water. What I'm gonna do is see how the shadows fall in the background. I wanna maintain those rich shadows, but we got nice, flat, soft light overhead, and we're just gonna utilize that. This is one of those days where you probably say, well, the light's not that great, but this kind of light on a stream like this, you know, with the water flowing, with the fall color, could be really beautiful. We're out in the wilderness and we got this beautiful creek here. I want to talk a little bit about using the highlights and the shadows in a scene as we're doing our exposure. In this case, I'd probably be doing a long exposure. I'm probably going to do 2, 4, 6, 10 seconds, something like that. Now in light like this, I'm probably going to need to put a neutral density filter on to get that slower shutter speed. Probably going to look for around f11, somewhere in there. But let's talk a little more about the shadows and highlights in today's quick tip, because light is something that is surprisingly overlooked in photography. I'm going to look at the highlights of the water. Where the white is where it's reflecting the most light in this case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to meter off that water, and since I'm using zones, I'm probably going to place it around zone 7 or 8 in the scale. Now, if you don't use zones, you can watch some of my other videos about that. But the bottom line is, I want the water to have a lightness. I don't want it to be clipped, but I want it to have that richness of contrasty lightness in relation to the surrounding tones. Now, here's another tip. What I'm going to do is consider all elements of the range. I may place my water, let's say, in zone 7 or 8, but now I got to think about what my shadows are going to do. One mistake I get from a lot of students when they have me look at photos is I see that they're trying to bring too much shadow in. They're trying to crunch everything into the midtones. HDR and dynamic range and all that stuff is great, and I use that a lot, but that doesn't mean we don't have shadow. It doesn't mean we don't want to get nice and dark back there in the background. It doesn't mean we don't want richness in the scene to bring out that contrast. Now here's one thing to bear in mind. Your contrast, your light to dark ratio is relative to the light to darks in your scene. Meaning, if your water is white, your darks are gonna look even darker. It's gonna amplify your contrast in your scene, even though in this flat light, there's not a lot of contrast through the scene. So I'm gonna wanna keep the whites white and keep the darks dark. Sometimes I'll even have to adjust my exposure plan a little bit to make sure I don't wash out those darks, overexpose them, and bring too much detail into that shadow because I want those rich shadows back in there. Now sometimes my visualization will be carrying through into post-production where I'm going to be darkening down those shadows with some burning or dodging or localized tools to give me the control I need. The bottom line is really look at your scene. I'm gonna set up on a tripod, I'm gonna put the water where I want it in the zone 7, 8 range so it's nice and light, but then I'm gonna think about the rest of the scene, especially in this flat light like this. I wanna make sure I'm getting richness in the shadows, and I wanna make sure I have a plan for achieving that goal so I have that contrast range in the image that's gonna give me that lusciousness to the scene. So just a quick tip today, use the entire tonal range, look at the scene, and then look again, and then make a great image. Okay guys, now I'm not sure I'm going to say we have anything earth-shattering, but we do have some neat images, and I want to look at these images from these overcast conditions on the quick video we did and talk about them in terms of the tonal range, maybe look at a couple other images I have up here as well, but in particular, I want to just talk a little bit about 3 things. The first being using the whole tonal range, the second being the exposure length for things like water and motion, and the third being just a little bit of post-processing on these images. Now let's take a look, and I'm going to show you the raw out-of-camera stuff with sensor spots and all. Now so you can immediately see the difference. So at the first element, let's address shutter speed. Here we're in this overcast condition, and we've got this image, lots of detail, neat spots, some fall color going on the river down here. I mean, it's nice, right? Where do we go from there? The detail, this is from the A7R2, phenomenal detail in here, and some neat stuff with the water. There's 2 sides to this, and I want to look at a couple other images. If you look at this quick portrait, it's not like an amazing portrait, I didn't even bother to wash his face, but it's a great portrait of my son Asher, in that it's him. This is phenomenal light for a portrait, and sometimes we get phenomenal landscapes out of light like this because you can get more midday stuff. You can get more broadly illuminated images in
landscape scenes. If the sun was out, you would have these specular highlights on these scenes that were really harsh, the rocks, the reflection on the water. So in a case like that, you really need to be sunrise or sunset, right? As soon as you start getting cloud cover, especially a fully overcast day like this one, where we actually had a little bit of drizzle, it can be a challenge to get that really rich, glowing kind of light, but at the same time, you have a different kind of light that you can use to your advantage. Now, back to the shutter speed. When we're dealing with water in particular, the shutter speed can be night and day in terms of motion. So we see we have some motion here, and we have completely silky motion here. And yet if I go down to this one, which is very flat, this is only 1 second, but there's less rapids going on if I turn to my right, looking downstream versus upstream, okay? And so here's this area with the shallow water, but what the long exposure will do here is actually make the water more clear, because the motion will average out any movement or ripples in the water. And now we say, well, this is kind of neat. We got neat trees, we got neat river, but it's so flat, right? Here's another one. This is 0.8 seconds. Of course, the faster the water is moving, the quicker it's going to get silky. How much silky do you want? That's up to you. But usually in a scene like this, with water, I'm going to want to lengthen the shutter speed at some point, because if I freeze the motion, it's just going to be plain and boring. It's just going to be a snapshot, not a snapshot, a snapshot of the river. And so let's go through, and here's an image. Now let's go into develop module. We have this flat image, right? But just because it's flat doesn't mean there's nothing to work for. Now let's come to using the whole tonal range and address that in terms of our post-production. Now I have to say that normally I would probably take a preset, and I would start with a preset from Power Workflow or Natural HDR, but I just want to do this manually today for the sake of analysis, okay? First of all, let's go to medium contrast on the curve. We're going to bring a little bit of detail into the shadows. I'm gonna bump up the whites a little bit. Now I want you to watch the histogram up here as I do this. Bring some saturation in. Bring some highlight recovery in just a little bit for the real hot specular highlights. And I'm going to work my curves a bit too. I'm going to lighten my shadows a little, but I'm going to darken my darks to keep some richness. Now, when I say the whole tonal range, and you can kind of see what I mean here, I'm spanning. I've got the whole tonal range from zone 1 to zone 10, respectively. And so here's a zone scale, right? 0 is black and 10 is pure clipped white at the far end. So here's this tonal range, the scale that I have, that I'm bringing out, and you can see in the histogram, the far left side, the black in the histogram is zone 0, and the clipped white in the histogram is zone 10. All these things cross over like we talk a lot about in the exposed workshop. Rather than saying, like I might do with an HDR, you see this a lot in HDR, and it's something we combat in the HDR tools that we make here at Seim Effects. If I punch a bunch into the shadows and recover a bunch of highlights, and I make it linear, and I bring up my shadows, and I bring down my highlights, what's happening? I'm crunching everything into my mid-tones. I'm not utilizing the tonal range. Now, I know this is extreme, but you've probably seen an HDR image or something that was done like this. Dynamic range and tonal range go hand in hand, and they need to be used together. You want the dynamic range, meaning you don't want to clip your image. You want to have the richness you want. At the same time, you want contrast. And so in this, what I'm doing is I'm saying, how can we get some richness? Let's bump up the clarity. Let's actually use the dehaze a little bit on this and make sure that we're bringing that in. Now, I just lost my dehaze in too many panels. Here we go. So I'm going to dehaze just a little bit. So I'm bringing some grittiness now into this. I don't want to go too much clarity. Now I'm going to actually go in and I'm going to crop the bottom off a little bit. I'm going to crop the top off a little bit. And I'm going to crop a little bit off the left so we have a little bit of a lead in. I got to be honest, this isn't a phenomenal image, but it is a good study image because we can see how we can bring out. And let's turn on our red clipping indicators. I'm going to push the whites. Rather than just being at zone 7, I'm going to push the whites up to zone 9, 10 range. Now you can see I'm going into zone 10. I'm pushing up the whites. As it's going red, I'm going into zone 10 or clipped white. Now I don't want that. I'm going to back at a stop or so off of that. And I'm going to do the same with the blacks. See how this is going into clip black? I'm going to go just shy of that. I literally have a histogram, a tonal range right here that's using the entire range. It doesn't mean there's not a lot of dynamic range in my image. It means I have the entire range in my image from black to white. You see this a lot in the masters. You'll see it a lot in Ansel Adams' work. And there's nothing wrong. Sometimes I'll even clip the blacks, not usually the whites, but sometimes I'll even clip the blacks to enhance that richness and really darken up my blacks. And then, of course, I could come in here and put a vignette or something like that. What is it you need when you grab your camera, you go out? What are you looking for? You're looking for something compelling, but you're seeing light, you're seeing tone. And so we could take this process we just applied to here, and we could apply this to different images, and you would see, kind of some richness come out. But honestly, I don't have any amazing fall color in here. I don't have, a phenomenal image. Here's one with a little more color. Let's see what it does. But my composition, honestly, is not earth-shattering. I have some nice images here. Why am I showing you images that are mediocre? Because sometimes it's reality, and these images are actually great for analyzing the use of the tonal range. Had I trekked up in the rain up the stream until I found the perfect composition, a log crossing over, or the right kind of tree, or maybe a grove of aspen, something like that, this light could have produced an amazing image. Now, I'm actually quite fond of my little image of my son here, and in this case, you get this really nice wraparound light. This kind of light in these kind of scenes is phenomenal for portraits. And I think that that's really worth mentioning, because a lot of times we're going out, we're doing a portrait session or something like that, and we want to be able to see what kind of conditions do I need to get a beautiful portrait. Now, is this a beautiful portrait? Not necessarily. I think it's nice. But in these conditions, in this soft light coming across in here, it's a giant softbox, and there's a ton of beauty in that light. These would have been perfect conditions for a portrait. So we're not only talking about these individual images, which may not be blowing your mind, and that's okay. We're talking about analyzing the different values of a scene. I mean, I actually like this one, but it's still not amazing. It's not an amazing image, Gavin. It's not an amazing image. Now let's take a look at some better images, though, from different places, right? What's the light doing here? This is post-process. Now let's reset this, again out of the A7R. Fairly flat overcast light, but different overcast light. Not quite as flat, and really able to bring out some color. Now we're adding interest. We're taking tone. We're utilizing most of the tonal range up to about zone 7 or 8, right? We're utilizing the tonal range. We're bringing in subject interest, composition in the trees, and we're combining that with the tone of color that the color brings into the image. Now the same with this, right? Here's a neat image of my mentor, Kim Whitmire, who passed away recently. And if you're not familiar with him, go watch the video on my YouTube channel about Kim Whitmire, because he was an amazing photographer. But here's him working on the beach, and we see all this stuff. We have a wide range of tone. In fact, most of this image is up in the 8 to 9 range, and yet there's no clipping in this image. And we could actually bring down that sky more. But here's our subject right here, okay? There's no clipping, but if you look here, we're actually going down. Let me darken this even a little bit more, not too much. We don't want to clip it. We're still using the whole tonal range. Even though most of it is in the 8 to 10 range, but just shy of 10, we actually have information down here in the zone 1 and 2 range, giving us that richness, that quality that we look for. Use the range, okay? So recap here. Here we're in this spot in the video, overcast, neat place, water flowing. Number 1, I'm considering how to make it interesting. Add movement to the water, which, by the way, did make this far more interesting. Without the movement to the water, these images would have been quite plain. Was it quite enough to be a masterpiece? Not today. But first we have using motion to combine with our tone, using the blacks, using the whites, combining that with using the tonal range, bringing that all into the composition, and then considering in the post-processing how to bring out the tonal range, how to utilize the whole tonal range in the post-processing by taking a flat image and not being afraid to push it a little harder. And that's a lot of what this is about. That raw file we produce in camera is a negative. It's not meant to be used as is. It's meant to be processed just like a negative was in the darkroom. We want to get it as good as we can in camera, and then we're taking that information and bringing out the color, trying to make it either lifelike or whatever our visualization was. But understand that raw file is not a lifelike representation of what we saw. And this varies, of course, from camera to camera. This one in particular is pretty darn flat out of the camera, but there's a lot of information there. But let's answer the question. I've entered a lot of competition, I've judged competition, and I've dealt with all these images. We look at this image and we're like, oh, it's pretty. What's wrong with it? And I get this a lot when I'm critiquing images. Why is this image not amazing? Is it because the light? No. We have some really neat light here that in the right conditions is beautiful. Is it because the exposure? No. The movement of the water is beautiful here. The detail of the image is beautiful here. So what's wrong? If this image came up in competition, what would be wrong with it? Is that it lacks a strong, compelling focal point. It lacks a strong subject. Sure, our subject needs to be a subject. There always has to be a subject. It has to be the primary focal point. All the rest is supporting cast. Sure, we can say it's the river. But it's not like there's this beautiful boulder. It's not like there's a mermaid sitting on this rock right here. There's not a subject, and the lack of a compelling subject in here. So the fault is mine, right? I exposed the image. I made the image right, and this is something that I think is important to mention to critique myself, even though I knew what I was making at the time, and I was just experimenting, and I took the best I saw in the scene. That's fine. But this won't end up on my wall, most likely, because it's just not compelling. I could take this, folks. I could take it into Photoshop. I could add cool effects. I could make this to make people go, wow. And yet, I could punish those pixels to death. It's not that I got it wrong in camera. It's that my image, my subject itself, lacks interest. I see this all the time in images that are well made. People say, well, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with it is the subject is not compelling enough. Could that change by changing the composition? Could it change by putting something else? Sure. Anything can change it. In fact, if this was a portrait, if I had a wedding couple standing on this rock, this would be amazing. So the study is valuable to me, the study in light. We take an image, we get a visualization, we combine the tone, we combine the motion, we combine the composition, we combine the light, and all that can be done perfectly, but we still have to make sure that our image is compelling. And of all your images, and that's why I want to bring this up, that's why I'm glad we're looking at some images that aren't amazing, that I wouldn't enter into competition. Of all your images, when you have an image and you're like, I've done it right, but it still doesn't blow me away. Maybe I need to work it to death. Maybe I need more effects. A lot of times, the real problem is simply that it's not interesting enough. The subject is not compelling enough. So whether you need a new subject or you need to change the way you look at the subject can vary. But that subject, you can have a good image right here. But if we really want to make it sing, I need to say, what one key point in this? Where's my focal point? How do I make one focal point in this that becomes the subject over and above everything else and is compelling and tells a story? Personally, I think that is what is wrong with these images. You may have your own opinions and you can share those over on the page, but I think this is a very useful study in understanding not only our motion, our tone, and our post-processing, but also in thinking about what are we looking for to make a great image.